Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Otto Von Bismarck Part 5, Prussia Ascendant. And yes, we are in a new location. The angle or the position of the camera may change. I'm not quite sure, I still gotta figure it out, but this is where we will be for a while from now. I'll put it that way. So, last time we saw Bismarck seizing more and more territory for Prussia. In this episode, that mission will continue. I'm excited to get into it. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
Hey folks, before we start, allow me to introduce our newest extra history artist, Nick. He'll be taking over for David, who is now...
I say ooh, but I think this video came out about 5 years ago, so this announcement is very much out of date at this point.
hard at work on our new extra sci-fi series. Say hello. Any increase in power brings an increase in enemies. But to Bismarck, enemies were as useful as friends. With the defeat of Austria and the consolidation...
Well, you know, I don't even know if Bismarck saw it like enemies and friends. As we've seen, Bismarck's policy was extremely pragmatic. It was basically just who could he use at that moment. And yes, Bismarck was very focused on building these important alliances with different countries, but... And I've mentioned this before, if Bismarck needed you, then he would use you in whatever way he saw fit, whether that was antagonizing you or making an ally out of you.
Of the northern German states into one hegemony ruled by Prussia, Bismarck's eye turned to the next problem. Founding Germany. But to do this, he would need to bring all of the southern German states under his control. He knew he couldn't simply annex them by force. He needed a unified Germany.
Yeah, I mean, Bismarck is pursuing this mission of German unification. This mission that is infused with German nationalism and national identity. If he goes about it in a violent, forceful, and coercive way, at least if it's violent and coercive on the surface, then it's not going to work out. People aren't going to feel allegiance to this new German state. He wants this new German state to be the embodiment of that national identity, and so he needs to bring people together voluntarily, or at least it has to feel voluntary, right?
Germany that felt like a country, not some occupied territory under a foreign rule.
Right.
And for that, the southern German states would have to come to him willingly, of their own volition. But they had always been aligned with Austria, so how could he get them to volunteer to be absorbed into Prussia?
Yeah, I mean, as we've seen so far, oftentimes it has been Prussia and the northern German states versus the coalition that is Austria and the southern German states. Now, Austria is basically out of the picture, but that doesn't mean that all of those southern German states are instantly on board with whatever Prussia is doing. Bismarck needs to find some way to unify all of these German states.
He would need an external threat, something that would make these states more afraid of other nations, and see Prussia as the benevolent protector and cultural brother that they could turn to in their time of need. And what better enemy than France?
Yes! And this is why Bismarck is so genius, and we've talked about it before, is he knew how to play politics. Bismarck had such a read on the political trends of the era, and he knew exactly how to manipulate those trends. So in this case, we're talking about nationalism. And I've already mentioned how this new German state had to feel like it was embodying that German national identity. And so what does Bismarck do? Well, he takes that nationalism and he uses it. He says, all right, you southern German states, now, you may not necessarily love us up here in Prussia. Maybe you were allied with Austria before, but you know who you really don't like? The French. I'm going to find us a threatening foreign enemy that can unify us as Germans. Instead of seeing Prussia as this foreign occupier, well, compared to the French, we are exactly like you. It sort of brings everyone closer together. And it's funny, when you think about the history of the sort of German-French relationship, if we go back to, say, the Napoleonic Wars really led to a lot of this modern German nationalism. First off, the liberal ideas and the ideas of nationalism brought from France, but also this German nationalism arose in opposition to French conquest during the Napoleonic Wars. So if we really trace it back, honestly, a lot of that German nationalism from its inception is sort of tied to France as this sort of oppositional force. And so for Bismarck to bring France back in to further unite the Germans is truly a brilliant move. But, it isn't that simple. He can't just say, all right, to war with France. Bismarck knows this. He's an intelligent diplomatic guy. That would be far more difficult than what he's going to do. Well, what he's going to do is fairly complicated, but it gives him more of an in.
Napoleon III, who had been willing to stand by and let Prussia pick off its neighbors back when it was a minor power, suddenly woke up and realized that a power to rival France had just emerged on its border.
Yeah, and of course France already has an interest in the growing Prussian state, what is beginning to look like an emerging German state. Even just from a sort of realpolitik balance of power perspective, right? Of course, there's the national aspect, but even remove the nationalism from it, France holds a really important spot in the European balance of power. Now, at this point, I suppose your greatest European power would probably be Great Britain, but the thing about Great Britain is that it really sees itself in many ways as a bit separate from continental Europe. It's doing its own thing. It's got its own global empire. If we're talking about the continent, France is sort of the premier power. There's a bit of competition with Russia, sometimes an alliance, But you would still say France is the number one power on the continent. And, the wealthy, industrialized German lands, if they unify, they could be a serious competitor to that continental French power. So from the get-go, this is a concern for France, and Napoleon III is just realizing that.
Already upset about the fact that he hadn't gotten any territory as a bribe for staying neutral in the war between Prussians and Austrians, Napoleon was primed and ready for a conflict with Prussia. But there was a problem.
And not to mention, Napoleon III was trying to keep his popularity up with the people, and he was fairly popular with the people. Well, we're going to see his end, either in this video or the next one. It doesn't end so well, but though he did face some Republican opposition because, here we are talking about Emperor Napoleon III. He seizes that position. He is this sort of liberal, modernizing authoritarian, a nice national war, or, doesn't seem like war's on the table yet, but pushback against some sort of national enemy, well, that's always popular in one way or another.
Both Prussia and France needed the other one to be the aggressor. Neither wanted to risk international rebuke or the possibility of foreign intervention in their cause. But Bismarck had a plan.
And that is absolutely key, and we've seen how cognizant of that Bismarck has been before. Think about the incursion into Denmark. He worked so hard to bring Austria into that plan, partially to sort of hijack Austria's legitimacy, but also so that Prussia wasn't solely responsible. And we can look at an example sort of outside of the series, look at the Crimean War. This is sort of perpetrated unilaterally by Russia, but is seen as unjustifiable by the other European powers, particularly Britain and France, who sort of march in there, tackle Russia, and stop them. Right? So Bismarck obviously understands that the diplomacy, the international recognition, international opinion is really, really important in a case like this.
Bismarck always had a plan. His plan was wait until circumstances presented themselves that allowed him to formulate an advantageous plan.
Okay, I don't know if I call that much of a plan, but if you don't have a plan, I guess you wait for one to arise, or wait for the conditions in which you could formulate a plan.
He did. Then, when the Queen of Spain was suddenly kicked out of Spain by revolutionaries, Bismarck knew it was go time. Because when a European monarch vacates their throne, there is always a multinational scramble for succession. In this case, you'd think it would be less complicated because the Spanish kicked out their monarch.
No, it's never less complicated. Succession is always a disaster. You can think back more than 100 years to the previous century the War of Spanish Succession. That succession crises caused this whole massive war, or you can think of Austrian succession, or Bavarian succession, or Polish succession. Succession causes a lot of issues. It causes chaos, and oftentimes it causes international intrigue of the sort we're going to see here.
And were essentially choosing a new one for themselves, instead of trying to untangle and war over some Byzantine genealogical tree. But no, they instead decided to offer the crown of Spain to a German prince. Bismarck was all for this.
And by the way, this is a common practice at the time, partially because there are so many different German states, right? And so when we look at the European aristocracy, there is a real oversaturation of German princes and aristocracy and, sort of people within a royal lineage of some sort. And so a lot of countries at this time select or are granted by the great powers some random German prince to be their new king. Now, as time goes on, that becomes a little less popular as nationalism grows, and a lot of these countries say, hey, wait a minute, why should we have a random German prince? We want a prince of our own. Or maybe we even want a republic. But in this case, they've decided to go for the classic German prince solution to the issue of succession.
Pushed for Prince Leopold to accept the offer, despite the fact that his name didn't even have Wilhelm in it anywhere. He knew full well that Napoleon III would have to rage against this offer. After all, if Spain ever allied with Prussia, which would be far more likely with a Prussian prince on the Spanish throne, France would be surrounded. King Wilhelm was against this, and even Prince Leopold didn't see great prospects in being king of a country that had spent most of the last century in revolt, but Bismarck's diplomacy prevailed, and the offer was accepted.
Yeah, King of Spain. I guess any monarchical position is an impressive one, but if you had to select from amongst sort of the big powers of Europe, although I don't even know if Spain qualifies as a big power at this point, you probably wouldn't select Spain. We're talking about a lot of political strife, a lot of chaos. Of course, Spain, the power of Spain, has much declined since its golden age. So maybe not the best gig you could have, but hey, still an impressive gig nonetheless.
All of these dealings were kept a very close secret, though. If France found out too early, the consequences could be disastrous. What Bismarck needed was for Leopold to be proclaimed king by the legitimate assembly of the people of Spain before Napoleon could make a move.
Right.
That way, if France declared war over it, the world would see them as the aggressors. Everything went perfectly. On June 19, 1870, Leopold agreed to accept the throne. 2 days later, he sent a coded telegraph to Madrid saying that he would arrive around the 29th. But then history turned, as it so often does, on a small thing. A cipher clerk made an error in decoding the message and wrote the 9th of July. The Spanish legislature couldn't be held in session that long, and thus was dismissed on June 23rd, which meant that when Leopold arrived in Spain, there was nobody present to make him king.
What an awkward situation. You arrive to be crowned king of this country, and the legislature has gone home for the moment. They're like, all right, well, we're dismissed. We're leaving. Bye. It's like, oh. All right, well, what do I do now?
People started noticing this Prussian prince kicking around in Madrid fairly quickly, and word reached the French papers. Soon, all of France was up in arms. So, not everything went perfectly.
No.
But Bismarck now played the spider, waiting silently.
Look, Bismarck was not omniscient. He couldn't tell what was going to happen 100% of the time. But I do think he did have an uncanny skill for reading the current political situation and predicting how things might go if certain actions were taken. So, that may not have gone to plan, but Bismarck is a very nimble political operator. You've sort of got no doubt that he knows where to go from here.
He knew that he couldn't be seen directing affairs. All he had to do was wait for the French to offer some insult, and then pounce on that to have the war he wanted. But he didn't factor in Wilhelm. The king had always been opposed to the prince running off and taking the Spanish throne, so when the French outcry flared up, the Prussian monarch put his foot down and told Leopold to withdraw his nomination. This was a huge diplomatic win for France, but like always, Napoleon III pushed it too far. He sent a diplomat to ask Wilhelm to...
Always pushing it too far, and once again, Bismarck has to work around his own monarch. That's how it works in a system like this. Bismarck is obviously the most qualified man for the job, but despite his power, despite his position, he is not the one at the top. Though, Bismarck has worked around this sort of thing before, and you can bet he's going to work around it here.
To swear that no Hohenzollern would ever sit on the Spanish throne. The king found this mildly insulting, as there was no way he would promise something like that in perpetuity. And besides, he had already pulled Leopold from the throne, and it wasn't likely to come up again. He felt that he had already been perfectly reasonable about this. So he replied that he could promise no such thing, and sent the French ambassador away. Then he had a quick telegram sent to Bismarck relaying the incident and granting him permission to inform the press. But Bismarck always had a way with vague instructions.
Yep, Bismarck was a master of, you could say interpreting, you could say misinterpreting vague instructions in whatever way would suit his political purposes best. And we're about to see an absolute masterclass in that here.
And with words. He did indeed inform the press, but the message he passed along to them was carefully edited.
Yes, and it says here the French were mean to us, but it's not even that. It's more complex and more impressive than that. Sort of the message that Bismarck passes along to the press. Of course, remember, the press that will print this throughout Europe, the message he passes along basically portrays a situation where both sides are rude to each other in one way or another. And so you can imagine how this is interpreted in the German states. They say, look at the French, they were so disrespectful to us, they insulted us, or where are you going to take this? And then you go to the French, and remember, it's not just the French were mean to us, but he also presents it in the way that the French will interpret this as a slight. And so they see this, and they say, look at what the Germans are doing to us. This is incredibly insulting. And so, once again, utilizing that nationalism to get both sides riled up at each other.
It wasn't false, per se. It wasn't even really a misrepresentation. He just omitted some words. Omitted some words in such a brilliant way that when the German people read it, they would think the French ambassador had insulted their king.
Yeah.
And when the French read it, they would think that the Prussian king had insulted their ambassador. That did the trick. The people were up in arms, and the French were ticked. Paris all the more so because, coincidentally, the telegram happened to come out on Bastille Day.
Bastille Day.
Napoleon III needed a war. His regime was largely unsuccessful, and his foreign entanglements had been a disaster.
Yeah, it's a complicated picture. You could talk for a long time about Napoleon III. I think he certainly accomplished a lot, especially domestically. Like I said, I think at this point in his career, it may not be going as well as he might have wanted, and I do think it's fair to say that a lot of his foreign policy, his foreign entanglements, also didn't go as well as he might have wanted. So, while I think it's pretty easy to talk negatively about him, I don't know if it's as simple as just saying his whole career was a disaster. Everything was, no, it was more complex than that, but definitely at this point, he was looking for a bit of a boost, and you can probably tell that it was going badly from how all of this ends for Napoleon III, which, I'm sure we're going to get to at some point.
He thought that if he could crush Prussia and gain territory for France, he would be back on stable footing. Soon, hundreds of thousands of French troops were pouring across the Prussian border. Bismarck had his defensive war.
There you go.
The French had invaded, and he had the moral high ground. In response, the southern German states flocked to the Prussian banner, but he played a dangerous game. By letting the French invade the Prussians, he had allowed them to mobilize first.
Yeah, now he actually has to fight the French. And sort of a common talking point, a common idea of the time and beyond, I know this was sort of a common idea around World War I, was that in war, whichever country was able to mobilize first would be successful. Now, what we found out is that it's actually a lot more complicated than that. But, yeah, getting a head start, that is a big deal. And so Bismarck has played this political game beautifully, but he is still in a risky position. Now they actually have to defeat France.
Now the German army had to get into position before their country was overrun. But here, Bismarck had the greatest weapon, Moltke. The French had better rifles than the Germans, but the Germans had better ideas about modern war.
Yeah.
Prussian observers had studied the American Civil War and knew that a train schedule could be as powerful a tool as any gun.
Yeah, you've got Moltke on your side, one of the most brilliant military minds of the era, and that's something interesting to point out as well. There were a lot of sort of foreign attachés during the American Civil War. I think, well, from a lot of different countries, especially a lot of Germans. I feel like there were a lot of German military men who had attached themselves to military encampments or particular officers during the American Civil War, and they'd paid attention and they'd studied the form of warfare taking place because, obviously, that was not that long ago from this. We're only talking about a couple of years prior, and that was a sort of massive scale, at this point, modern war, so there was a lot to learn from.
Moltke embraced the idea of the railroad and the telegraph. With coordination and these new technologies for movement, he not only got the German army to the front in time, he got more men there than the French did.
Wow.
But he did more than just this. He rewrote the rules so that German units no longer simply marched in great columns and fought in great lines, but rather acted as small units less susceptible to fire. He pushed the idea that, since piercing the center of an army was no longer as much of a concern due to the deadly nature of modern rifles, they should worry less about artillery getting overrun and more about how effective it was in a fight. So he moved his artillery closer to the action and had them working in conjunction with his units. He had a general staff, the only one in Europe, whose sole purpose was to draw up war plans in peacetime.
And this is still a sort of very advanced idea, talking about a general staff, sort of this top-level staff comprised of the top men from each branch of the military. Of course, it can differ in structure depending on when you're talking about and which country you're talking about, but sort of these minds brought together to plan and attempt to execute on these plans when possible. This is just a very intelligent and very modern way to do military planning and to go forward with war. Like I said, we're talking about really the development of a lot of very modern ideas of military engagement, some of which emerged here, some of which were already ideas and just needed to be implemented. It's not like von Moltke. I said this before, it's not like von Moltke just came up with all of this on his own. These ideas are taken from a lot of different places, but he certainly was a very intelligent military mind.
And think through all of the probable scenarios of coming conflicts. With these advantages and a superiority in numbers, Moltke immediately took the offensive, rapidly pushing the French back across the border and charging into French territory.
And when we say rapidly, we mean rapidly. And maybe it shouldn't be so surprising. I mean, we've seen how successful the Prussian military has been so far in this series. Under this brilliant leadership, modernization, all that sort of stuff, but they really trounced the French. This was, I think you could call it an extremely embarrassing defeat for France.
Time and again, the French reeled before the Prussian forces. Soon, the French armies were falling back, trying to link up with reserves further down the line. But the retreating army was spotted by a small cavalry brigade, and nearby Prussian forces were ordered to move in and cut them off. Unfortunately, due to some wild miscalculations by both sides, the Prussians had just sent 30,000 men to engage what turned out to be 130,000.
Oh.
The French were beleaguered and demoralized, but had an overwhelming advantage in men. The Prussians were ready for the fight, but ended up pinned by the French artillery. In desperation, the Prussian commander sent a message to a nearby cavalry commander saying that the artillery must be cleared. Famously, the cavalry commander said, "It will cost what it will cost," and readied his men. Obscured by the terrain, they burst through the cannon smoke at the last minute, bearing down on the foe, giving them only 1,000 meters to react. The cavalry crashed into the artillery and tore through it, silencing the batteries that had so long hampered the Prussian army. This is arguably the last cavalry charge to significantly change the course of a...
I was going to say, we're talking about a successful and decisive cavalry charge in the 1870s. We are really coming to the tail end of the sort of broad usefulness of cavalry in warfare, so this is a pretty remarkable moment.
a battle in modern military history. But even 1,000 meters is a long ride when you've got modern guns firing at you.
Yeah.
Of the 800 horsemen who set out, only 420 made it back.
Ooh.
And it turns out that Bismarck's son was among this regiment. It was late in the night of August 16, 1870, when a messenger arrived to tell Bismarck his eldest son was dead. Quartered only 20 miles away from the battlefield, Bismarck rode like a man possessed to find the body of his son, only to be greeted by his very much alive son laughing and joking in a farmhouse nearby.
Hey, there you go.
He had taken a bullet to the leg and would be out of the fighting, but was in no mortal danger. After a few more hard-fought victories, the Prussian forces bottled up the French at Metz and forced the surrender of 140,000 men.
Whoa.
The French only had one army left to them, an army battered by an attempt to relieve the forces at Metz. But Moltke had no intention of letting this force get away, and in the days following the surrender at Metz, he maneuvered his forces and encircled this final army. A breakout attempt was made, but so exhausted and undersupplied were the French at this point, it soon became clear that a breakout was impossible.
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing has just gone disastrously for the French. They sort of had the initial jump on the Prussians, I mean, sort of by design, by the design of Bismarck, frankly, but from that point onwards, the Prussians have held the advantage. They've been quicker, they've planned better, they've had better supply lines, better communication. They've just been pushing the French back, defeating them. It's been absolutely demoralizing for the French, as we can see.
By the next day, 100,000 men, and with them the greatest prize of all, Napoleon III,
Yep.
who was personally leading this army,
He was
surrendered.
captured.
France no longer had a real army on the field. Now it was time to think about the future. For Bismarck, that meant peace terms. For Moltke, that meant pushing on to Paris.
Interesting. Okay, I kind of thought we would get through the end of the war and the aftermath in this video, but we ended up spending some more time on the conflict itself. And so it looks like next time we're going to have to pack in the end of the war, the aftermath, the unification of Germany, and sort of the domestic operations of the German state. I imagine we're not going to cover all of that. But I've got a lot to say in terms of the next episode. You know, there's a lot to be said about the sort of long-term consequences of the Franco-Prussian War. And there's also a lot to be said about the consequences of the unification of Germany and Bismarck as chancellor and Bismarck's domestic policy. So we'll have to pack that into the next episode. I imagine I'll be doing a lot of talking, but I always do a lot of talking, so come on now. But very fascinating episode. We finally got to the Franco-Prussian War, a very important conflict which we can expound upon next time. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon. It is linked down below. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.